I'm sorry, I have to do it. Suicide Squad just came out. People are talking about it. We have to address it. It's got to come up, okay? It just does. It just does. I'm sorry. Sorry, not sorry. Okay, we're gonna do it. So what is funny about all of this is that there are some people defending Suicide Squad fervently. Somebody was saying that there was another YouTuber that I think I've had run-ins in the past with that has gotten into like a full-on crap slinging match with his own community over it. There's just a lot of funny stuff going on with people with regards to this game. However, I do think that the vast majority of people are all on the same page, that it seems like this is a game that was born out of a desire for quick monetization. It went through a handful of changes. I've told you guys that I've had 2 people come out in the last 2 since the early access launch, since my review came out. And these were people I confirmed as former employees and former people that worked on Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League at Rocksteady. And these people have told me that my speculations about the game seeing multiple versions of its monetization scheme, those speculations were correct. So I took that as confirmation that those big crates that fly in and give you loot, that those were at one point loot boxes that got reworked into the rewards for missions instead of charging you for loot boxes. Because let's be honest, they look just like loot boxes. I mean, and they give you loot in boxes with random spawns and draws. Like, it's a loot box. You just can't buy it separately. And it seems like at some point they decided all the monetization would be tied up in cosmetics, and then the seasons were going to be free. And they tried to just come in and do all of that to fill in the gaps and try to win some favor from the community, but it was kind of too little too late. However, one of the most hilarious defenses I've seen people try to make is that the game is graphically one of the most impressive games ever released. And they say the game is graphically stunning. Everything else sucks, but the game is graphically stunning. I remember seeing that, I think, in the IGN review, and I was just genuinely confused because I don't see it. I don't see it as very graphically impressive. The character designs are fantastic. Dell, who's a friend of the channel, one of the lead character designers on most games that you've played, like, fantastically talented artist. Yeah, Del Walker, he is just amazingly talented. And he's done designs on everything from The Last of Us Part 2 remastered to Halo to Suicide Squad to Jedi Survivor. Like, you name it, he's probably worked on it. And some of the most iconic character designs you've seen in recent years, he probably put together, okay? It's outrageous. But this guy's portfolio is madness. So everything he touched and his team touched looks amazing. Like, the character designs, the materials work, the texturing, everything is fantastic. There is no doubting that. However, I do think that there is a marked step down, perhaps in art direction, perhaps in style. There's a mixture of things. But NikTek, another fan, or rather friend of the channel, maybe he's a fan, I don't know, but he's a friend of the channel. He put together this video 5 days ago. And this gets even funnier, okay? So, which is why I'm showing you this in this order. This is a video just called "These Two Games Are 9 Years Apart." And I'm gonna share this in chat so that you guys can go over there, give it a view, give it a thumbs up, and share the love, okay? But he posts this, and it's simply titled "These Two Games Are 9 Years Apart," okay? He shows a big sweeping pan of Metropolis. I'm sorry, it's just not even close. And then he goes back to Batman Arkham Knight. Batman Arkham Knight released in 2015. And there are some stylistic differences, obviously. This is much more gritty. It's set very clearly on like a rainy night. It's overcast. There's a lot more individual light sources as well, whereas Metropolis is just very flat. But come on, man. I mean, come on. It's to me, it's not even close. There's also a lack of contrast. So you'll notice, like, also the blacks on this screen are not very black. Like, the darkest points are brought up to be like a sort of dark gray. and the brightest brights are brought down a little so they're not completely white. So you end up with an image that's just a little bit flatter. And the reason I'm pointing this out is because sometimes what happens in these side-by-side comparisons is that people will compare HDR captured footage that's been converted to SDR and compare it to a game rendering in SDR and be like, oh, see, this is way better. But that's not actually the case. So the reason that's important is because HDR content gives you a wider kind of range of color, if you can think of it that way. And when you convert it to SDR, it flattens it down, which makes it look kind of flat like you see on the screen now. Whereas an SDR piece of content is balanced around this range, so it has the full contrast available to it. That would normally be a reason to think that maybe this is not accurate. However, that's not what's happening here. Okay, I've also tested it by turning off HDR, running the game natively without any of that stuff, and it's not actually what's going on here. What's going on here is that the game, artistically, they chose to have a flatter look with lower contrast, probably to bring out detail and shadows. And, you know, with a co-op game, a shooter game, you need to be able to see all the enemies on screen at all times. So it's not necessarily about having the darkest of the dark contrasted shadows. But I mean, even if we just do like this, I'm going to capture this. Maybe I can also even pull up Photoshop, and we'll try to fix it right now. So we can just do this right now. Hold on. New canvas. Okay. So we have like this. If I just paste the cap I just took in there, and if I just try to add a little bit of contrast to this, okay? This is what we're dealing with. For one, we can just go auto and let it try to adjust it. You see, it brightens it up a lot because Photoshop likes things super, super bright. But you can actually go in there and pull shadows down darker. You could crank the contrast a little bit to also darken the darks a little bit more. You could increase the vibrancy of some of the color. You could do all sorts of things to make it look a little bit more dramatic and less flat. But if we do like a side by side, this is it before, this is it after. Okay? Like, and that's just post-processing effects, okay? It's just post-processing effects. So if they wanted to take the game from this and turn it into something a little bit more vivid, they could do that very easily. If they wanted to decrease the vividity and instead just go in and like maybe pull down the shadows, darken it a little, they could do that too. Because this is all just post-processing. But they went for a flatter look at the outset, which is why it's an artistic choice. Okay, I just want to be clear that there are elements of this that are purely artistic. Okay, I don't like the artistic choice. I like things with a little more contrast, but that's just what they're doing. Beyond this, though, I mean, you can see the difference with Batman Arkham Knight. A lot deeper blacks, much more contrast. Even in here, you can see the brights are much brighter. It's also, there's a lot more speculative reflections, so light bouncing off of her shinier clothing, whereas on here everything's very flat, muted, and matte. There's also a lot more dynamic shadows and things. You can see the light shining through the chainmail, or whatever this is, chicken wire. I don't know. I think chicken wire is what you'd call it. But anyway, there's a lot more of things like that. And Harley actually had a butt. Yeah, calm down, guys. Calm down. I do agree there was a noticeable shift, let's just say, in their approach towards Harley. Maybe it's because she was playable, they felt more pressure to have something a little more restrained, but I don't know. I just don't find it to be like, and the other thing is like the city is just so boring. Like that's the most amazing thing to me, is that it's a big city. You recreated Metropolis and somehow it is extremely boring to look at and swing around. Whereas Arkham Knight is, I believe, a good bit smaller. Like the maps are way smaller, and yet it's way more interesting to swing around and look. It's just crazy. You can just tell like there's a mixture of art design and stylistic choices with balancing, with contrast levels, with all of that stuff. But then there's also just, at the end of the day, like plainly clear technical differences. Now, part of this, Digital Foundry, you guys were saying, was defending Suicide Squad because it is 4-player co-op, and therefore it can be harder to achieve the same level of fidelity that you might see in a single player game versus a multiplayer game. I get that. I understand that. I don't see how that changes the comparison that these games are a decade apart. Like it's just okay. That you found the reason, you identified a reason for it not looking as good. It still doesn't look as good, which is all we're really saying, is that this game from a decade ago looks better than this game that cost $70 that just released today. And you're like, yeah, but it looks worse because of XYZ. Okay, it still looks worse, you know? Like, it just does. Yeah, the water to me is the most telling, because this is something that's purely secondary. You don't go in the water. Not even King Shark is going to swim, okay? It's purely for the visuals. That's all. There's nothing else to it. There's no gameplay function. It's just here to look pretty, okay? And you notice in Suicide Squad, even with like, you know, all of the tech we have nowadays with ray tracing or quarter resolution ray tracing, with like, you know, what they did with Spider-Man 2, where they did quarter resolution ray tracing on the windows and stuff. There are ways that they could achieve similar things. Granted, this is cross-platform, so it's not always as simple, and they're targeting 60 frames, so that's another thing. But if we're just going to compare apples to apples, it's like, okay, this game running, there's like no real reflection, not even seemingly. There might be some screen space reflections at super low resolution or something like here, but it's very, very minimal. And I'm just going to compare it to the water simulation in Arkham Knight. The simulation is better. The texturing and lighting on the water is better. The cresting of the waves, the foam on top of the water is better. It's not even close. It's not even close. So after this video went kind of viral. It's at like 930,000 views. After you guys have clicked on it, it should be at like 931,000 views because I linked it. However, there's another video that he did to just rub salt in the wound, okay? This is where it gets funny, okay? This is where it gets funny. He did another. I'm going to post the link to this one in chat as well. This one just says, these two games are 13 years apart. And he pulls up Suicide Squad again, showing a panning shot of the city. And then, where's he going to transition to next? What game could he be comparing it to? Arkham City. A game from, correct me if I'm wrong, the Xbox 360 and PS3 era. Now, obviously, there are some raw technical comparisons that it's going to do better on nowadays. Like you can say, well, the resolution's higher now. Yes, there were not 4K TVs or displays, at least not consumer grade, in 2010-11. Like there just wasn't. Okay. You could say, oh, well, the subsurface scattering and the poly counts are higher. Yes, because it was technologically impossible to have them higher. But when you look at the art direction, when you look at how they used the tech that they had, it really appears that there's just something missing with Suicide Squad. There's just a lack of artistic direction that made the most of the hardware. And it's something that I've heard discussed by game devs, where they say, like, we've gotten spoiled by all of the processing power we have nowadays, because we have so much. We don't have to be as frugal. We don't have to be as intentional with it. We can just kind of throw whatever we want on screen and not have to think about it that much, because the engine will kind of fill in the gaps, and it's just not that important to be super intentional. But back in like the 2010, 2011 era, you had to be extremely intentional with every single polygon. You had to be intentional with every single light source. You had to be intentional with everything, because you only had so much processing power to work with. And nowadays, there's just so much in these modern consoles and on PC that, and then also with like the upscaling tech that we have now, you're seeing games that, Jesus, you're seeing some games that straight up launch with like a rendering during performance mode at like sub 900p, and then they upscale higher to try and hit a stable frame rate, because they can just rely on the upscaling to fill in the gaps of performance. Like, we don't really have to try that hard. To me, yes, Like the fact that Suicide Squad is a 4-player co-op game, yes, that's technologically impressive, but I think one game looks much better artistically. It might not have as many bells and whistles, but it just goes to show you how those bells and whistles do not define a game. They do not make a game great. You know, just because a game has ray tracing doesn't mean it's going to look better than another game that doesn't. Just because a game can render at native 4K or 1440p or whatever it is with Suicide Squad, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to look better than the 1080p game. Because at the end of the day, the art direction is going to have a much bigger role to play in what the game looks like than anything else. And I'm sure the people that worked on Suicide Squad are very talented artists. I totally agree. I just think, like, if I had to pick one over the other, I would absolutely prefer the direction in the core Arkham trilogy. This new Sunset Overdrive cartoony look that they were going for, I just don't think it holds a candle. I understand they wanted to go with a different tone. That's the one thing that seems to be consistent, is that they really wanted to differentiate this game from the core Arkham trilogy. But this is why, like, Suicide Squad is so weird. It's because parts of it make it seem like they really wanted it to feel different than the Arkham Knights and Arkham City comparisons. And yet later on in the game's marketing campaign, they pivoted and tried to constantly remind you that this is in fact the same developers, same makers of the Arkham series. And it is basically a continuation of those stories and everything. And it just leads you to be kind of confused, because it's like, wait, are you trying to shed that previous history, or are you trying to add on top of it and grow from it? Because if you're trying to grow from it, you're doing a real poor job, because it's not the same tonally. It doesn't look the same. I don't think it's as impressive artistically. There's just, of course, in gameplay wise, I'm very frustrated by the Switch. But if you're trying to also differentiate it, why are you constantly comparing yourself to those games, to that franchise? Because it's like, oh, from the makers of the Arkham series, and we took our Rocksteady DNA of all these games and we tried to build on top of them and do this and do that, and we're trying to add to the stories, and it's in the same universe and all that. But unfortunately for these types of projects, they have to crash and burn before anybody in a position of leadership seemingly learns from it. What makes it particularly heartbreaking in this case, though, is that Rocksteady was on top of the world. Like, they were making some amazing games. I know some people are like, oh, well, everybody gave Arkham Knight crap, so everybody just now is going back and loving on it. The thing people gave Arkham Knight crap, there were two things. Number one, they gave the game crap because the Bat Tank sections were highly repetitive and felt very out of place. I stand by that today. I say that I would prefer another Arkham Knight over Suicide Squad any day of the week, and the Bat Tank sections were weird and out of place and super contrived. Like, super, super contrived. Like, we're just going to be, let's be real. It was clear they built a Bat Tank and we're like, how can we use this in the game more? And then they just decided to be like, oh, Arkham Knight is going to have all of these tanks that he has that you're going to fight waves and waves of. And there's a line in the game where the Arkham Knight says, and I know you're wondering why I don't just put my men inside these tanks, because you're too scared of killing anybody. So then they would just overwhelm you. Well, I didn't want to make it too easy on you, myself. Like, he straight up said, I didn't want to make it too easy. And that's the point of the whole premise of the game and all the combat, is that the Arkham Knight, for whatever reason, just wanted to make it more difficult on himself, even though he could just put a person in each of his tanks in Batman Arkham Knight, and Batman wouldn't be able to do much of anything about it. He'd just be screwed, He'd just be screwed. But still, the game, I think, is better than Suicide Squad. That being said, it's not saying much, but I do think it is better. And the other thing people were frustrated by was the god-awful PC port. And if you don't recall, if you weren't playing games around that time, that's totally fine. But Batman Arkham Knight had one of the worst PC ports of that entire generation of games. It was horrible. It was barely functional, and it deserved all the hate it got. Absolutely. I don't understand how either of those points make Suicide Squad any better. It's a games as a service. The only question is whether it holds up under those standards. The price of entry is kind of high, but time will tell. Well, the fact that the PC player base is lower than Marvel's Avengers, I don't know how the game is going to be successful if the player counts are lower than that other game that died. You can't even buy Marvel's Avengers right now. It's unlisted. You can't buy it today if you want to, unless you find like a hard copy somewhere. But you can't buy it. Like, they are at less than half of those player numbers. That's crazy. Technically, their peak player count right now is slightly higher than Forspoken. Slightly. Warner Brothers just paid a decade in salaries to receive another flop. Yeah. It's pretty tough to dig yourself out of that trench, I'll tell you what.
He took my thing.